everyone. Sorry, just getting my PowerPoint back to the right page. My name's Emily. I'm here from Growing Gardens. Gonna do a little one-on-one, 102, continuing from Monday's session on growing food at home. And first, I just wanted to thank Sunday Parkways, Portland Bureau of Transportation, and Kaiser Permanente for making all of this possible. So just to reintroduce myself, my name's Emily. I manage the virtual gardening consultation program at Growing Gardens. So for folks that are wanting an extra one-on-one support, we now have that as an offering, and I also do some other special projects. And my background is in small scale organic agriculture. And then for the last 6 years, I've been managing the home gardens program at Growing Gardens, which I will talk more about. So Growing Gardens has been around. It's a local nonprofit in Portland that serves the state of Oregon and beyond. Started in 1996, and we have 3 main programs. Our Home Gardens program, which works with families that have limited resources to help them grow food at home in their backyards or in community gardens. Our Youth Grow program that works with elementary schools and high schools to do garden-based hands-on education in the garden, using the core curriculum standards, integrating math and science into the classroom and also after school. And our Let Us Grow program, which works with inmates in all of Oregon State correctional facilities to provide college-level horticulture education, produces thousands of pounds for the food for the kitchens in the prisons, and also provides employment certifications for folks so they can get jobs when they are released. So first off, I just wanted to shout out some of the awesome Black-led farms and food organizations in Portland. I know a lot of folks are looking for concrete ways to dismantle systemic racism, and supporting Black-led organizations and Black-owned businesses is a great way to shift resources and power that have been systematically denied to the Black community for more than 400 years. So these are some of the folks that we work with at Growing Gardens that are doing work in the food system, and I would highly recommend learning about what they do and giving them your dollars. So Black Future Farms, Mudbone, and the Black Food Sovereignty Coalition. So check them out. They're really amazing organizations. So reviewing from what we talked about on Monday. Monday, we talked about getting your garden set up, where you're going to put it, what are kind of the important factors in that, what to grow, so what are the best crops for our area, how to actually go about planting, so how to plant by seed, how to plant by plant start, and then just kind of the more general tips on keeping your garden alive and having it be successful. So I think the video is probably still available if you want to go back and watch that one to kind of get caught up, or if you're just getting started, that one's probably the most relevant for you. But today we're going to talk about some more topics that are really helpful, have been really helpful to me in terms of my own food production in my backyard and also in farming. So soil health being basically the most important thing. Garden planning, so really how to maximize your harvest and some of the ways you can go about thinking about planning out your garden. Some of the common pests and diseases and how to address them in organic ways, and then what to do at the end of the season to protect your garden and also just have a longer harvest. So soil health, this is a personal favorite topic of mine because soil is amazing and is a super diverse, thriving ecosystem when it's balanced and healthy. That is really the whole core of how your plants are thriving and getting nutrients and getting water and all of that. Sometimes different, often larger scale agriculture tends to ignore the soil or sort of see it as just the thing, just the structure that holds the plants upright. But it's really so much more than that. There's a whole life going on there. So a lot of the philosophy that I follow around gardening is to really treat the soil as its own ecosystem, as to really pay attention to the life that's in the soil. And if you can help that stay healthy and thriving, then your plants are going to be healthy. So kind of the first thing around soil health is to add compost. Compost is organic matter that it actually only creates, it only contains pretty low levels of nutrients. So for the most part, it's not the only thing you want to add into your garden, but it does improve your soil structure. We talked about that on Monday. It boosts the activities of the different microbes in the soil that are actually the ones that are taking the nutrients and minerals that are in a form that the plant can't use it. And after they digest it, then it becomes available to the plants. So it's really important to the soil for a lot of reasons. And there's a bit of controversy around, can you add too much compost? On most farms, the scale at which people are growing and the high production means that it's hard to get enough compost, but in smaller scale gardens, and there was actually just a study that came out from OSU Extension that looked at urban gardens in Portland, and they concluded that we have generally too much compost in our gardens. And why you can have too much is really has to do with that compost basically increases the activity of the microbes. So you can have too much microbial activity, make there be too high concentrations of nutrients available. And that can be damaging, or at least just have your garden be less productive than it could be. So generally the rule of thumb is to add, an inch or so a year of compost. The best way to know if you have too much or too little is to just get a soil test, and they'll tell you the percentage of organic matter that you have. And generally the recommended amount is around 5%. But again, there's definitely controversy. Some people will say you can never have too much compost. So, do your own research and, try it out in your garden and see what works best for you. So like I said, compost doesn't necessarily have high concentrations of nutrients itself. So in order for our plants to grow, there are kind of three, what they call macronutrients that our plants need, and then a whole bunch of micronutrients that we won't really talk about. But the three macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So nitrogen is responsible for all of your leafy green growth. So making your leaves and your stem and sort of the height of your plant. Phosphorus is responsible for root development and also supports making the fruiting and flowering parts of the plant. And then potassium is just kind of all around general plant health and structure. So whenever you get a box of fertilizer, that's like a balanced fertilizer, or actually any fertilizer, it always has three numbers that stand for the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, N, P, and K. And so from there, you can sort of look at, if you do a soil test and you know that you're deficient in one of those, you can pick a fertilizer that has a higher concentration in one of those. But for general vegetable gardening, our plants need roughly equivalent amounts of each of those three nutrients. So you can get what is called a balanced organic fertilizer that will have numbers like 4, 6, and 5 as N, P, and K. And that's going to be just an overall balanced fertilizer. You can have problems, like particularly with potassium. If you have too much potassium in your soil, that can tie up other nutrients. So you don't want to just add things without, especially high concentrations, without doing a soil test, just because that can create more nutrients is not necessarily the best thing. And you can also, if you don't want to buy a pre-mixed fertilizer, then you can also buy different amendments. So nitrogen Rich things are going to be like feather meal. Phosphorus rich amendments would be like bone meal, and potassium rich amendment would be kelp meal. And so you can, a lot of times the fertilizers you buy are just going to be those things mixed together, but you can also get each of those amendments separately. So pH is another important part of soil health, because different nutrients are available to plants at different levels of pH, which is maybe a little too complicated, but the biggest thing you need to know is that in general, our vegetable plants prefer a pretty neutral pH, and our soil in the Pacific Northwest, because of the amount of rain that we get, tends to be a bit acidic. So that's why when we're starting gardens and using our native soil, we add lime, which is calcium carbonate, and that helps raise the pH. And this right here is a chart that shows basically how different the availability of different nutrients at different pHs. And so you can see, for example, at really low, super acidic pHs, the levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium are all really low. And then same thing when you get on the super alkaline. And for most vegetables, you want it around, 6.5, 7. There are some exceptions. So blueberries, for example, like to have more acidic soil, and that is because they need a lot of iron and manganese, and those elements are more available to the plants at lower pHs. So if you are going to do blueberries, then there are different ways to acidify your soil. A lot of people use azalea fertilizer, sulfur. You can basically look that up, but yeah, so knowing the pH of your soil is great. It's something that will be included in your soil test if you decide to do a soil test. Another big thing around soil health is to avoid compaction. So back to the soil being a whole ecosystem of life under the soil, underground. So all of those microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, they need oxygen, they need the soil to be able to drain. And if the soil is getting compacted, then they're not able to do that, and that life's not able to thrive. So a couple pieces of advice around that is to have, if you do have an in-ground garden rather than a raised bed garden, in-ground gardens are a lot more likely to be compacted, is to have designated pathways so that you're not stepping on your soil. And every year you always have the same pathways. And that way, over time, your soil's really able to build and get that nice structure that's basically being created largely by worms and macroorganisms moving through the soil and creating these air pockets, and also roots going through the soil. There's a few different philosophies around turning over the soil. So if your soil is really compacted, one way to decompact it is to basically turn it over, to basically shovel and flip it and kind of chop it up. And that's the way a lot of folks every year in their garden will prep the soil by basically chopping in or turning in the cover crop. And that, can help break up whatever compaction, especially with our clay soil. It can just happen. And there's other folks that really prefer not to turn the soil over, because essentially what you're doing is organisms that are living at the top that like it a little drier and a little warmer are getting flipped to the bottom where it's wetter and colder, and then organisms that are at the bottom that are like it wetter and colder are getting flipped to the top. And so you're basically just disturbing the ecosystem that's already been created, and where things are working and thriving, and just sort of disturbing that. And then it takes time for those organisms to sort of readjust. So a lot of folks use like what's called a no-till system. And still, though, there is, if you do have compaction, you do need to break that up. And so a lot of what is popular with that method is to use a broad fork, or if you're a home gardener, just to use a regular garden fork, and essentially push the fork down into the ground, wiggle it around to kind of break up the compaction, but you're not actually flipping the soil. And then the other thing you can do if you have compaction is to plant root vegetables that are basically natural tillers that are going to send their roots down deep into the soil and break up that compaction without you doing anything at all. So that's pretty cool. All right, so now I'm going to move to talking about garden planning and some of the different concepts that are helpful in terms of thinking about how you're going to go through your season and plan it out if you are a planner. So succession planting is one that can either refer to planting the same crop over and over. So in this photo right here, the example is radishes. So you can see radishes at different stages of growth. And so if you imagine if you planted all of those radishes at the same time, you would probably have, 100 radishes all at the same time, which I don't know what you would do with. But for in this example, they've planted radishes, and this is actually from, I think it's from Ian at Portland Edible Gardens. So he's someone cool you should check out. They've planted radish and then waited a couple weeks and then planted another row and then waited a couple weeks and then planted another row, waited a couple weeks. And that way you have this staggered harvest so that you always have radish that you're harvesting throughout the season. So that's something that's particularly good with things like root vegetables, like carrots, so that you just have a continuous harvest of carrots and not, hundreds of carrots all at once, unless that's what you want. So root vegetables are great to do that way. Anything that you're going to cut once and it's not going to grow back, like head lettuce would be another one to do succession planting of. And then the other, some people call it relay planting, but I still call it succession planting, is the idea of planning out your garden so that you always have something in the soil. You always have something growing. And what that looks like is often looking at your season in terms of spring, summer, and fall, looking at what you're going to have planted. For me, I always start with summer because those are the vegetables that are going to be in the ground the longest. Mapping out my garden in terms of what's going to be there in summer, when I'm going to plant it. So for example, if I was going to plant tomatoes in one spot, I know that I'm going to plant my tomatoes mid-May to June. And so, but that means I have March, April, and basically all of May. So 3 months where the tomatoes aren't going to be in my garden. And so I can use that spot to plant something else, but I need to plant something that's going to be planted and harvested and out in 90 days. So you can look at a planting chart, figure out what takes 90 days or less to plant and grow, and look for what's called days to maturity, and find something that's less than 90 days and then plant that there. And then by the time you're ready to plant your tomatoes, you'll be pulling whatever was in that spot out and ready to put in your tomatoes. So that's just a way, if you're in a small garden, to really maximize your space so that you always have something growing in that soil. Companion planting is, again, back to the philosophy of nature knows best, is if you think about nature, there's rarely ever a situation where there's just one plant growing all by itself with nothing else. Plants have really beneficial relationships with each other and tend to grow all together. And so that's one thing we can do in our gardens to really take advantage of the different ways in which plants work together collaboratively. So for example, planting flowers close to something like a squash or a tomato that needs pollinators means that the flowers, they're really designed to attract pollinators. So they bring the pollinators in, they send this signal like, look, there's great things to pollinate over here. Once the pollinators are in your garden, then they see the tomato blossoms and the squash blossoms and they're able to pollinate those, which helps you actually get your tomatoes and squashes, which you wouldn't get if you didn't have pollinators. So planting flowers in between things, planting herbs or things that smell can have the effect of deterring pests from your gardens. And then there's also structural ways in which plants can work together. A really popular one is the native tradition of the Three Sisters planting, where you have beans, corn, and squash. typically dry corn or feed corn and dry beans and winter squash, but people do it in all different configurations. And the idea is that the corn grows, and then the beans, which are pole beans, will use the corn as a trellis to grow up. And then the squash are planted around the base, and they have the purpose of shading the soil so that the water doesn't evaporate as quickly, and also potentially preventing, different creatures, squirrels that might otherwise want to come into the garden and climb up the corn and eat your corn. The leaves tend to be a little bit spiky, and so the idea is that they're kind of preventing those pests from coming into the garden. So there's so many different things you can do with companion planting. I think it's great to learn what are the different needs of different plants and the purposes of and what different plants can offer. And then there are guides out there, planting this near this. But I think understanding the philosophy behind it is really valuable to figure out what makes sense for your garden and the things that you want to grow. So another big one for garden planning, and this is really a long-term planning tip, is to do crop rotation. So crop rotation is a way of basically ensuring that you're not planting the same thing in the same spot year after year after year, because what can happen with that is that one plant, or even if it's just that same plant family, tends to use a lot of the same nutrients in the soil. So if you plant it year after year after year, those particular nutrients are getting depleted. As well, the particular pests that are specific to that plant are coming into the garden, and then if they lay their eggs, and then the next year you plant the same thing, they're right there ready to go. And same thing with diseases. So if you switch it around, if you can move from plant to plant, and most people do it in terms of either thinking about plants in terms of their their growth pattern, so root vegetables, leafy vegetables, vegetables that produce like a fruit, and rotating those around, or thinking about it in terms of which plants are really heavy feeders. So again, plants that produce a fruit like a tomato or a squash tend to be heavier feeders. Light feeders like a lettuce that doesn't need quite as much, and then plants that actually give nitrogen back to the soil like legumes, beans, and peas. So, and rotating those three around, or looking at it in terms of plant family. So you have your Solanaceae family, nightshade family, that's tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, eggplant. You have your cucurbits family, so cucumber, squash, melons. You have your brassica family, so broccoli, kale, arugula, radish. Trying to think what other families there are. But anyways, rotating those families from bed to bed together, because they have similar nutrient requirements, similar diseases, similar pests. So thinking about your garden in terms of not just what you want to plant this year, but what you planted in that spot last year, what you're going to plant in that spot next year. And I just have a journal where I basically write it down, because there's no way to remember that. And all the years tend to blend together. And so I just keep it really simple and just rotate things around the garden, so that I just know that every 4 years, or, every couple years, eventually I'm going to rotate things back into the same, but at least the soil's had a break for a couple years. So, which brings us to pests and diseases. This is my favorite resource for basically just identifying for yourself pests and diseases. It's the University of California IPM database. And what it allows you to do is basically look up pests and diseases by the plant that they're affecting. So I can't remember what I typed in for this one. I think maybe cabbage, or kale or something. And so you type in the thing you want, and it'll pull up all the diseases that affect it. And particularly if they're regional diseases, it'll usually call that out. Same thing with pests. It'll pull up all the different pests that tend to be interested in this plant, as well as different kind of cultural factors. So things like nutrient deficiencies or watering problems or things like that, things that like we as human are affecting the plant. And you can just go down the list and pop up pictures and see if it looks like what you're experiencing. And then usually they'll have suggestions for what to do. So it's a great resource. And for me, just probably the best way that I have learned so much about what's going on in my garden is to just look it up. So here are some of the common pests that I've experienced in my home garden. There's more than this, but these are kind of the big ones, at least in my garden, that I look out for. So aphids are tend to be on my kale. They tend to be either gray or green and really small and have these little scaly bodies. And they need to be attached to the plant and feeding in order to be alive. So one really great way to get rid of them is just to spray your plant with water and knocks the aphids off, and then they die pretty quickly after that. Some people use soapy water, but they're a pretty easy one to, as long as you catch it quick enough, and there aren't a ton of aphids, you can just spray them off, they'll die. If you do have a ton, honestly, the thing that I do is I just cover the part of the plant that's infected with a paper bag or something, cut it off, and then throw it in my green bin to go to the city to get composted. And that's kind of, with any really bad infestation, just removing the plant is usually the best thing to do. Slugs are a big one, especially in the spring here, because it's so wet. They will just go to town on your lettuce greens. The thing that I found that worked the best is Sluggo. They have an organic Sluggo that's safe for kids and pets. And that's what I use. There's other, most people in the Pacific Northwest have already done a lot of research, but there's a ton of different ways that people talk about beer, copper, diatomaceous earth. But for me, Sluggo has worked the best universally. And so that's what I use. Cabbage moth caterpillars are an interesting one because they're really hard to see. You'll see the big munchy spots that they've taken out of your leaves, but they turn the exact same color as whatever they're eating. So if they're sitting on your leaf, they can be really, really hard to spot. But if you're looking for them, you can find them. And the best way to get rid of them, honestly, is just to pick them off. And they attack mostly the brassica family. So collards, kale, broccoli, cabbage. And if you just look on the underside of the leaves and the top of the leaves, you can just kind of pick them off, feed them to your chickens or whatever. And then the other option is there's a spray called BT, which stands for a word I'm going to pronounce poorly, like Bactolitherius, which is a compound that's naturally produced by plants, which they've been able to isolate, and actually kills the caterpillars when you spray them. So that's another option. Leaf miners are an interesting one. You'll see them mostly on your beets and on your chard. They make these little trails, that look like on the picture here. And the best way to get rid of them, because they are like a larvae stage and they're in the leaf, sprays don't really work. But if you can catch it early enough, you start to see the telltale signs. You can just pull those leaves off and throw them in, the compost. And usually that'll stop the infestation. But that's the best thing I know, is just to remove the leaves as soon as you start to see them, and be pretty diligent, or as soon as you see the spots show up, pull that leaf, and it won't hurt the plant, but you do need to catch it early. And then this is my favorite photo here, because it's not actually a pest, but when I first saw it in my garden, I was like, what is that? That looks crazy. So it's actually a stage of a ladybug, which is actually a great bug to have in your garden because they feed on aphids. So if you do see something that looks like that, let it be, because it will turn into a ladybug and help you with any kind of aphid problems that you might have. So these are some common diseases, nutrient deficiencies that you might see in your garden in the Pacific Northwest. Powdery mildew is one that affects the cucurbits family, the squashes, cucumbers, melons. And what it looks like is this white powder that starts to kind of grow on your leaf. It's a fungus that is just naturally existing in our soils. And when you get like a splash of water that hits the soil and then goes on the leaf, that's usually how it starts. And eventually, if it gets, if the leaf either stays moist or there isn't like enough airflow, eventually it'll just kind of grow and cover the leaf, and then the leaf won't be able to photosynthesize at all. So the best thing is kind of preventative, like with any other stuff, is to, when you're watering, just try and not get too much water on the squash leaves. And honestly, in my garden, I just kind of always assume that eventually by the end of the season, I'm just going to have powdery mildew on my squash leaves. And it doesn't really affect the plant too much until it really covers the whole leaf. So it's kind of just usually hoping to wait it out. I have heard of people using like a milk spray, but I haven't actually used it myself, so I don't know if it works. Blossom end rot is one that you'll see on your tomatoes, but can also be on other vegetables that like make a fruit. And it comes from the plant not having enough access to calcium, which doesn't necessarily mean that your soil doesn't have enough calcium, but sometimes if you have kind of sporadic watering, like water a lot and then no water, that can affect the plant's ability to uptake calcium. And so that can be a reason, or sometimes the temperature can affect the plant's ability to take up calcium. So one thing I do is when I plant my tomatoes, I just add a little bit extra calcium into the area where I'm planting the tomato, just to kind of hopefully, in the event of, you know, whatever, that the plant just has a little bit extra access to calcium. There are, I think, some sprays you can get if you start seeing these on your tomato plants that'll help quickly get calcium to your plants. But it's not a huge deal. It does happen. And sometimes it's things that are really beyond your control. But you can just remove those fruits, and then the plant will concentrate fruits on the rest of the plant. And, you know, just keep your watering like pretty consistent. And, you know, not planting things too early is a way to kind of prevent some of the temperature, ways in which temperature can affect calcium. And then dampening off is one that mostly affects, I mean, it's just mostly seedlings. So if you're starting seeds indoors, again, it's a fungus. So it happens when the plants are really waterlogged, their roots aren't getting enough oxygen, and just in general, how funguses thrive is usually kind of wet, moist environments. So once it happens, there's not really much you can do to actually like turn it around, but you can be preventative by just not keeping your plants moist but not super soaking wet, and then also just making sure there's really good airflow wherever you're growing your seedlings. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about, at the end of the season, things you can do to help your garden thrive. One of the easiest, well, I'll start with, for those of you that want to really extend your harvest and be growing year round, the cool thing is that in our climate, that's very achievable. Our winters, we get snow and we get frost, but they're not so intense. We actually have a lot of things that can grow through the winter here. And I should say they're not actually growing through the winter. They're basically staying alive through the winter. So the philosophy around extending your season is you actually need to plant all of your fall and winter crops in late summer, because you need those plants to get to maturity by, you know, mid to the end of October, which is when we don't have enough sunlight for the plant, or warmth for the plants to actually grow. Or if they do grow, they're growing like by a millimeter. There's just not enough sun. So what you want to do is plant them early enough so that they get to their full grown size by winter. And then throughout winter, they're just living in the ground, and you're able to go out and harvest them whenever you want. And if you plan it right, you can be harvesting all winter, but you need to have enough things because they won't keep growing. So you'll harvest it, and, you know, for the most part, they'll just stay alive. Sometimes you do need to protect things. And you can see in this photo, there's like a little mini hoop house created with greenhouse plastic. You can also use row cover or agribon, rime, are these kind of like fabric cloths that you can use that help create a little bit of a microclimate, but water can still go through, and it'll help kind of keep some of the snow off. So you can build these shelters, but a lot of things are going to grow through the winter just fine without a shelter. So I've grown spinach just like in the snow, or had spinach growing in the snow, kale, collards, a lot of that stuff is actually super frost tolerant, and is going to live without without too much assistance from you. And then what happens is in the spring, once the daylight comes back and the warmth comes back, those plants that have been living through the winter are going to just go through the end of their life cycle. So they're going to start flowering, which is, so if you want to do overwintering broccoli, planting it in July or August, it'll just grow and have big leaves all through the winter. And then in spring, when the plant gets more light and gets more warmth, it'll start actually producing the broccoli florets, because that's the flower of the plant. And then that'll be the first thing, at least in my garden, that's usually the first thing in the spring that I'm harvesting, because things that I've planted in spring, usually, in end of February and March, aren't ready until mid-April or so. So season extension, I would, it can be challenging because in the summer, you just want to fill your garden to the max with everything. And a lot of times, especially the warm season vegetables like tomatoes and squashes, they aren't ready to be pulled out. They've only just started producing in July and August. So you can't use those spots to do your overwintering. So it's definitely something that when you get started in the spring, to think about what you're going to want to have growing over the winter. And for areas of your garden where you don't have things planted, or even around the things that you do have planted, it's really important to protect your soil in the winter, because we do get a lot of rain and snow. And even though the rain's not maybe necessarily super torrential all the time, the slow drops of rain just consistently on bare soil are just going to compact your soil. So there's kind of two methods that most people use. One is just covering your soil. So covering it with cardboard or burlap or leaves, or, the things you've pulled out of your garden, just covering the soil so that there's something that's sort of in between the rain and your bare soil. You can also do sheet mulching, which is this picture here, where you're taking layers of straw and compost and layering them, so that then over fall, winter, early spring, it's composting right on top of your garden. And then that compost is essentially available organic matter to your garden for the next spring. And this is actually a way that you can create your garden for the first time if you don't want to do much digging, is to actually sheet mulch a lot of layers on top of your garden. And then that brings the composting process brings in a lot of macroorganisms and microorganisms that are going to help move through the soil, digest all of that compost, and then create a pretty fertile plot of land for you to grow in. And then cover cropping is just a wonderful way to have life growing in your garden, which is also supporting, the roots of which are supporting a lot of those organisms that are living in the soil. And there's so many different cover crops you can grow. And cover crops are basically plants that are growing through the winter in your garden. And in the spring, you either pull them out or chop them in, and they're then able to add organic matter into your garden. Some cover crops that people use are what they call nitrogen fixers, which means they have little bacteria that live in the nodes on their roots that are able to take oxygen, or that are able to take nitrogen that's available in the air, that otherwise wouldn't be able to be available to your plants. And they actually convert that nitrogen that's in the air into nitrogen that the plant can use to grow the green parts of its plant body. And this is great because it means that, you know, you're getting nitrogen from the air and then putting it into your garden. As long as you are, the nitrogen is going to actually grow the plant itself. And so when you chop it in and kill it in spring to add to your garden, you're actually adding free nitrogen into your garden, which is wonderful. But not every cover crop does this. So you got to look for crimson clover is one that does. Austrian field peas is another. But no matter what plant you choose, there's a lot of different, it kind of depends on your soil and what you're looking to do, but there's a bunch of different cover crops you can use that will do different things just depending on what it is you're looking to do. So I just wanted to pause and see. It looks like we didn't get any questions during this one, but I wanted to answer one question that came up last time, which was about an avocado tree that was started indoors, and the person was wondering sort of where should they be putting them outside, whether it should go in a raised box or in a container. And so for avocado, they really are not very good in the cold. So planting it in something that then in the fall, when it starts to get cold again, you'll be able to bring back indoors. So just a big planter is the way you want to go for that. Don't put it in the ground or in a box because it's not going to be able to live there permanently. All right, so thank you guys all for being here, and thanks to Sunday Parkways and Portland Bureau of Transportation and Kaiser Permanente. Obviously check out, there's so much more happening on the Sunday Parkways website, and remember to stay home, stay healthy, stay active. And then on Friday, I'll be doing more on composting, making your own compost and making your own vermicompost. And then lastly, I just wanted to shout out to SlidesGo, Flat Icon, and Free Pick, which were all free resources, the graphics, the template that I used. I'm not a graphic designer, so I really appreciate people who are out there making this content available to the rest of us to have pretty looking slideshows. All right, thanks guys.